Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Time Is Now TV. And I'm very, very pleased to have a guest with me today who's going to help me go through the political issues of the day and those fascinating election results from last week. A lot to discuss. We're going to cram it in fast and we're going to hit hard and heavy, no punches pulled as always. So I hope you enjoy the minutes to come. And if you do, remember as always to share it round and click on the follow button. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce my guest, Mr. Calvin Robinson, one of the foremost Conservative political commentators of the moment. Calvin, absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Bill, you're very kind. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. And as I said in the introduction, we've got a lot to go through, so we're going to hit it hard and heavy and get stuck in straight away with a bit of a review of last week's election results. There were some interesting trends. It looks like England has become very much a stronghold for the Conservatives. That's England outside of London. And some of the areas that used to be considered the red wall, it would appear, are becoming a blue wall. But we also have a different situation in London and certainly a different situation in Scotland and Wales. So before we go into too much detail, what was your take on those results? What was the impression you were left with?
I thought it was a very, very interesting polling day. First of all, seeing all of those Labour seats drop. We saw Labour lose seats to the Conservatives, to the Lib Dems, and to the Green Party of all parties, which told me that this wasn't actually a Conservative gain. This was a Labour loss. Labour have got a lot of making up to do, and we've seen their decline since about 2015, really, when Corbyn came into power. And it's been a rapid decline, and they've been given opportunities to up their game. They haven't, and so the voters have left them. They've abandoned them. You know, during the last general election, people said that people were lending their votes to the Tories, and I believe that was the case. But now it's gone so much further that people aren't just lending their vote to the Tories; they're removing their votes from Labour. Even in London, so we saw Sean Bailey did fantastically well. No one expected him to win. No one expected anyone but the Labour Party to win in London. But Sean was right up there, right up his rear end with those results. And I was genuinely quite surprised. But of course, the problem with Labour is they don't learn their lessons very well. My dad used to say some kids have to learn the hard way. And I think Labour is one of those kids because already Sadiq Khan is saying, well, I've had the best results I've ever had, or the best results we've ever seen in London. I have the biggest mandate ever. And he's not looking at the bigger picture in that, yes, more people might have voted or he might have scored more votes, but he didn't get a massive majority. And the Conservatives were right behind him there. And in London, that's a big deal. We know how London-centric this capital is, unfortunately. So he's not learning his lesson. The Labour Party aren't learning their lesson. They're doubling down and saying, well, we're not left-wing enough. Really? You think that's the lesson to take away from all this? That you're not left wing enough? Not that you've gone too far to the left that you see anyone in the centre ground as far right these days. Okay, we'll leave you to it. But I don't think it's something that we should be celebrating. And I don't think the Conservative Party should be celebrating it because they're going to get complacent. And that is the last thing we want to see. What we want is real strong opposition that will hold our government to account. You know, over this pandemic, we've seen the Labour Party say, you're not pushing these restrictions hard enough. And it's like, who's standing up to the Tories? Who's being their opposition? Even Conservative members should want to see some opposition. And we have none of it right now. It's been a very, very disappointing election, really.
Yeah, and you've opened up quite a few issues there with that opening salvo. And I think one of the ones I want to pick up on, because it ties in nicely with the lack of real opposition about the measures taken during the pandemic, is the fact that for the past few years, first of all, there was a sort of rump of UKIP support that was, touching around double figures percentage-wise in some places. That then went over to Brexit Party. But now, since the change to reform, and I don't know what they'll change to next week, but whatever it is this week, that fell away and that went on to the Conservatives' figures. It would appear to me, anyway, there looks almost a direct correlation between increased Conservative figures and the decrease in the UKIP stroke Brexit vote, which does tend to accentuate a Conservative victory when perhaps it isn't about them being popular, as you say. But it does leave us with an issue because there isn't an opposition to the general direction of travel, and not just on pandemic policy, but on economic policy, on embracing wokeness, on green industrial revolutions, on all of these things. there isn't an opposition that's actually being heard anymore. And the smaller parties, the insurgent parties, were squeezed to hell in that election. I think that's how I see the results. And you're right, yeah, Labour has got some learning to do, and we'll talk about that more later. But just focusing on this, the Conservatives squeezing out the insurgent parties, do you think that this is the way now, that the Conservatives have no real opposition from the right?
It's interesting, isn't it? I'm friends with Richard Tice. I think he's a great guy, but he doesn't have the same sway that Nigel Farage had in that area. And Farage pulled through UKIP and then through the Brexit Party, pulled the right into a very sensible position in holding the government to account and making sure that the government took notice of these cultural issues that people care about, that the Conservatives often forget because they're so focused on the economic issues. So we do need that from the right. Unfortunately, Reform hasn't managed to do that this time around, and I don't think it's any in particular person's fault. I think it is a case of the party structure. They didn't necessarily have that same issue, that same like marching banner behind them as they did with Brexit. It was much less clear this time around what Reform were there for or what they were there to do. Likewise, in London, we obviously had the Reclaim Party, which I've been advising, and I think it's a similar issue there in that people know that the Reclaim Party stands for freedom of speech and that it's anti-woke, but there's no one uniting issue from the right to kind of bring everyone together. So I think Reform and Reclaim, who have been working very well together, should create a formal pact. I think it's better to have one party on the right of the Conservatives than to have lots of splinter parties. So they would have strength in numbers there, but also they need to change the aim of their game, and they need that strong banner that everyone can get behind, that reason to support them. So that's very important. But also, we have to remember that it's not just about the Conservatives. So the Brexit Party and UKIP took votes from Labour too, especially the Brexit Party. They were very good at this, siphoning votes away from traditional Labour Party voters, and as well as Conservative Party voters. On the issue of Brexit. So if we can do that around the cultural issues, and everyone around the country outside of London has pretty much had enough, I think, of all of this woke nonsense being shoved down our throats. So if we can unite on that somehow under a united banner and say enough is enough, and these are the parties that will represent that opinion, that perspective, then there's a chance for them to get some more numbers. But looking at it pragmatically, these parties have never been about Westminster. So UKIP, they had an MP. The Brexit Party didn't really have any MPs. It's never been about that. It's always been about applying pressure, and they can still apply that pressure even from the outskirts. So it's just important that we kind of, refocus those outlier parties so that they can come together and apply that pressure to the government and to the opposition. Because as you said, and I've said earlier, there is no opposition yet.
Yeah, and I agree that you can achieve a great deal with pressure from outside of Westminster. But harking back to just prior to the referendum being granted by David Cameron, because I think he felt he was forced into it. It was, I think the word was he's going to shoot the UKIP fox by giving us a referendum in his manifesto. Mm. But that was down to the belief within the Conservative Party that that UKIP were going to take, maybe not take seats, but take enough votes so that the Conservative incumbent would lose, whether it be to UKIP or Labour or whomsoever. Yeah. So that pressure that you speak of has to have some form of oomph at the ballot box as well. Otherwise, you get exceptionally good speakers like Laurence Fox and some of the people within the Brexit Party, very, very good speakers who will turn up every now and again on the media and make the best of that airtime, but without the smack, the push of MPs thinking, hang on a minute, we're about to lose our job here. It doesn't tend to make an impact. Would you agree with that assessment, or do you think perhaps it can be done a different way now?
No, entirely. That's how the pressure is applied, but it's still in line with my views in that these parties don't win seats, but they can take votes, and that's how you apply that pressure, because that's what MPs care about, their vote share. So if we say we're going to stand in Hartlepool and put a Reclaim candidate in Hartlepool, the Conservatives and Labour would be worried about that situation. They might not think that the Reclaim party would win the seat, but they certainly would consider whether they could still win the seat anymore. So it is applying that pressure in the same way, it just doesn't get the same end result.
Yeah, and I think you're right as well that these kind of parties can take as many, if not more, votes off Labour than they do off the Tories. And certainly in the West Midlands that I used to be primarily involved in, I used to spend a lot of time explaining to Tory friends who were very angry with us, saying, "Oh, you've cost us a seat. Actually, we're probably giving you a better chance of winning it because we've got the votes out of the council estates and the places that would never dream of looking at the Conservatives." So I think there's an interesting point there that it can hurt both parties. And taking that, we look at the Labour Party, which appears to be dead in the water. It looks like it's ready to be picked apart by either the Greens or a patriotic working class party or somebody. And there doesn't seem to be any way forward for them. Because would you? I feel like Keir Starmer's a lame duck leader. I feel like he's had a brief chance and he's blown it completely. Am I being too harsh? Do you think he's got something left in him?
No, bless him. There's nothing there, is there? I don't think the Labour Party is dead. I think it's stagnant. I don't think any other party will pop up and replace it. The way this country works, with the two-party system, it will always be the Tories versus Labour. But it does need a resurgence. It does need a fixing from the inside out. So it's going to be a lame duck, at least, for a while until they fix it internally. Keir Starmer is clearly not the leader to do that. They're going to have to find a new leader. The problem is they're not going to want a leader who is so-called progressive. They're going to want someone who is very left-wing because that's the way the party is leaning at the moment, which means it might be a cyclical issue. Where even the next general election, Labour could still be losing by a landslide. So it might be a good 10 years from now until we see Labour come back, which has its pros and its cons, but they need someone. And you hinted earlier on that Tony Blair's sticking his neck up above the parapet again. Perhaps someone like him or someone from his camp could, because in my lifetime, as far as I can remember, he's the only person that's managed to win for them. So that should be where they're looking, if that's what they want to do.
Well, I still carry the trauma, actually, of 1997 and realising that he'd won and then spending what seemed like an eternity of seeing his grinning face as he took us further and further into what I would regard as hell. But I hope that he doesn't make researchers. But Lord Adonis started speaking about this on the media. Sometimes when you've been around long enough, you know when people are testing the water.
Yeah.
And he does appear, I mean, in that hugely impartial interview that he had with Good Morning Britain, where it was Alistair Campbell interviewing him, which I thought was a fantastic piece of journalism. This is a man who I think he's still got some ambition. And if you look at the cast of characters who might take over from Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Jess Phillips, I don't think there's anyone there who seriously can do the job. So there is perhaps more than we might lightheartedly discuss. There might be a chance of a Blair comeback. I mean, could it be? Could it be? I'm having nightmares thinking about it.
I don't think even Labour are that silly to really, bring Blair back. But someone from his camp could potentially come in. What's happened to the Miliband's? They've gone quiet. Maybe someone, quite moderate like Ed or David could come and lead the Labour Party. I'm not sure. I dread to think if Tony Blair did actually come back, what would happen? We still haven't put him to trial for his war crimes, so I'm not sure he's ready to lead the country again.
Yeah, well, I actually, after his interview on G&B, I got contacted by a lot of people who used to be activists saying, if he comes back, where are we going to go and campaign and how can we go and stop him? It was the greatest motivator I've seen in a long time. My inbox was full. Oh, that's jolly good. Keep talking, Tony. So we think that Keir Starmer has had his moment and that the replacement, whosoever it may be, isn't going to lead them to immediate success. Although I think you got onto something interesting about the Milibands and particularly David Miliband, who I thought, although I disagree with his politics, is a very good presenter. But they're not going to come back next election. I think we're probably both on the same page on that one.
Yeah, Ed Miliband happens to be a neighbour of mine. I've never met David, but he does look like he would have been the better leader. I think he got robbed there by his brother last time around, so maybe it's his turn. Who knows? But like we've said, it's going to take a while yet. The Tories have got another win in them, which is actually surprising in and of itself, isn't it? How are the Tories doing so well? They've mishandled this pandemic throughout. Okay, the vaccine program has been a success. They should celebrate that. But economically, they've been disastrous. Pretty much crippled the country. Liberty-wise, they've stripped all of our freedoms without our permission, and people are okay with it. People are fine with it. I don't know what's going on in politics anymore, to be honest with you.
I'm a bit confused, I must admit, because it seems to be the least liberal-minded, least freedom-loving government I've ever seen. And economically, they're spending, well, they're not just spending money, they're creating and inventing money like nobody's business. They're talking about green industrial revolutions, which, they aren't market-driven, let's be honest. So where's the conservatism in that? But the truth is they're going to be in office for some time to come. So what I'm thinking here is that we have a Conservative Party that is drifting to the authoritarian, almost socialist ground. And I think that Boris Johnson and co, whilst they dress themselves in the clothes of freedom and liberty, are quite the opposite. And I just wonder, this argument that we hear, and I think you've heard it as well from your commentaries, well, we vote for the Tories because they're not so bad as the rest.
Mm.
That can't be good in the long term. That's going to be absolutely disastrous for our democracy, isn't it?
It's not good for democracy, you're right. And people voting for the Tories because they're the least worst option or because there's no alternative is not what we want to see. But I do think, I've been negative so far about the Tories. Flipping it around to the positive, I do think as we come out of this pandemic, we will see a kind of them refinding their values again. Because I honestly do think that Boris Johnson is more libertarian than he's been allowed to be or than he's been able to be throughout this pandemic. I do think we will see them pushing some more conservative policies in the liberal sense. I don't think we'll see small c conservative policies for a good while, although the Common Sense Group, they released a fantastic book this week on some policy suggestions around the cultural wars and how to address those issues. So there are elements of real, true small c conservatives within the Conservative Party, but generally speaking, it's a liberal party. I do think, or I hope, that they'll refine their liberal ways once we come out of this pandemic, and they'll fix the economy. Hopefully not through taxation, because that would be very anti-conservative and very socialist of them. They'll have to find more creative measures. It's just, I say this all the time, but I have to say it in that I personally invested so much in that party over the years, time, energy, money, in trying to get them elected, because they are the party that told me they believed in fiscal responsibility. I was fully on board with austerity as a way of fixing our economy, and then they've ripped up that book over recent months, and they found that magic money tree that we campaigned against, and they're splashing money out left, right, and centre. As you said, they're not even spending money; they're creating money, and all of this is it's the antithesis of what I've campaigned for all these years. So it's so frustrating. But I do think, or I hope, that they will find their way once we come out of this bloody disease, this virus that's spreading around.
Well, their economic policies are, may well start to bite them in the backside quite quickly, because there are some figures on inflation coming out of the States which are quite frightening. Inflation in the States has gone up to over 4%. And they've been doing the same as us on obviously a much larger scale, inventing magical money trees and spending law. Now, it might be old-fashioned, but it's one of those things that used to be an economic law that, you create lots of money and eventually inflation will go up. And, for many people who aren't 100 years old like me, who can't remember inflation, it wasn't very pretty. So those economic policies are going to, I think, be an issue short term. But I want to bring us on to something juicy now, because you said, oh, they're going to be more liberal, they're going to be more liberty-minded. You think that they'll do that once they've got through the perceived crisis that we're going through at the moment. We have Twitter police, we have social media censorship, we have people being stopped from speaking out. You yourself have experienced some pretty horrendous treatment for simply speaking your mind. This Conservative government, far from actually doing anything about that, has actually been complicit in that approach and the way things are going.
To some degree, yes, but also, to play devil's advocate and bat in their corner for a moment, they've just announced in the Queen's speech that they're going to put measures in place to ensure that freedom of speech is protected in education, as it should be, and that universities will have to stop no platforming people, and students will have ways of holding their universities to account. And all of that is very, very vital, because freedom of speech starts and is fundamental to our education system. And that's why we've become how we have over the past decade or two, because we've been shutting down conversations in academia and pushing just one narrative, this woke narrative that's infested all aspects of our society, but it started in education. So if we protect freedom of expression in education, we have a good chance of reversing that over the next few years. So while some elements or some policies coming from them are not as liberal as they should be, on the other hand, there are elements within the party that are out fighting to protect it. So it's quite a broad church, the Conservative Party. And again, this comes back to why we need these small outlier parties to hold them to account, and why we need good think tanks to put pressure on them as well and provide policy suggestions to make sure that they actually stay a little bit conservative.
Yeah, and talking of being a little bit conservative, they said that they would deal with the BBC, for example, which is without a doubt, and I challenge anyone to say that this isn't true. The BBC is state broadcasting of left-wing pro-EU propaganda at virtually every point. It is the most woke vehicle I've ever seen in my life. And yet we have to pay for it in our taxes. Now, we've had a Conservative government now for ever, and yet the BBC still isn't being sorted out.
No, you're right there. As someone who's been campaigning to defund the BBC for a while now, it's very, very frustrating. We've had promises, or not so much promises. We've had support from the Prime Minister in the past. He's now reneged on that support. I don't know why. I can only make assumptions. The previous regime were very in favour of reforming at least the BBC. This new regime, less so. But something needs to be done. Something needs to change. The BBC, like I said, it's become very woke. It's just social justice warrior nonsense, 24 hours a day being shoved down people's throats, and we have to pay for it under threat of prosecution. That's not right. It's not okay. We need to update that at the very least. Defunding the BBC is the main goal, but there are smaller milestones along the way. It would be great to decriminalize the license fee so that people that don't pay the license fee don't go to jail and don't end up in filling up the magistrate's court. It would be great if we could get some kind of political balance in the BBC, removing the bias and making sure that all opinions and perspectives are shared. The way that you mentioned it was very Remain focused. Absolutely so. Even if they did get a Brexiteer on during the referendum period, it would always be someone on the extremities of that debate. And even then, it would just be that one person on a panel of 5 with four, well, maybe 3 Remainers and a moderate chair who's also a Remainer. So we need a good, broad and balanced diversity of thought and opinion on the BBC, and we need to decriminalize it. And also we need to look at the money, because they're wasting money all over the place while asking for more all the time. The license fee has just gone up. It costs an arm and a leg, and if you're an elderly person that has paid it all of your life under the idea or the promise that once you reached a certain age you would no longer have to pay it, well, they've got reneged on that too now and made sure that OAPs also have to pay for the TV tax. It's outrageous what they're doing.
But you would keep a BBC. You wouldn't privatise it, for example. You would keep it just with changes and amendments to it.
I personally would say to the BBC, you guys have to figure out your own business model, but you're not going to be publicly funded anymore. And or maybe they have to put a commission together and sort. But I wouldn't dictate to them or prescribe a particular model, whether it's a Netflix model or I don't know. That would be entirely up to an independent commission and or the BBC to think about, or even the government. But I just want to make sure that we're not forced to pay the BBC for the privilege of watching any other TV channel. That doesn't make any sense to me.
I've always beat the drum for privatising it, and often other fellow Conservative believers don't go with that. And let me run a theory by you, and shoot it down, because I'm interested in why this wouldn't be an obvious choice. Privatise the BBC, probably raise about 15, 16 billion pounds from doing that if you sell it in component parts, as figures I've looked at from Institutes of Economic Affairs and other organisations suggest. Privatise it, put that money into a tax cut. What's wrong with that?
Perhaps that could work. Like I said earlier, the Conservative Party is broad and balanced. There are 2 elements to it. There's the more libertarian front, or the more neo-lib front that would say, privatise it entirely, sell it all off. And then there's the more conservative front that would say, actually, it's a British institution, we need to keep it, but it does need reform, it needs to change. I'm happy with both arguments. I just don't like how it is at the moment.
BBC is tied in with another area that I think is interesting because you've got a background in education, and the BBC and education do often work together. Now, some of the things, and again, I'm posing these points so you can either shoot me down or tell me I'm right. It's up to you. But some of the things that we're being seen taught by the BBC and by the educational establishment, critical race theory, man-made climate change is going to destroy the world and it's all our fault. We need to decolonize the curriculum. Much of British history, we have to look at it from the bad, how bad it all was, and so many other certainties, about politics lessons where some people are bad and some people are good, and all sorts of things that are actually allowed on a curriculum. 72 genders, things like this. Surely we need not just a conservative party in government that has a few people arguing against this, but surely they've got to grab this and say this is poisoning the minds of young children, and rather than teaching them critical thinking, we are brainwashing and indoctrinating kids.
I entirely agree with you. I don't know which point to start on, but decolonizing the curriculum is a good one. The idea that we need to remove dead white men from the curriculum and replace them with people of ethnic minority status, it's pure tokenism. The curriculum, we should be teaching the best there has been, whether it's literature or classic art or music. We should be teaching the best there has been, and we should provide a canon that does that. And that's what the curriculum is. And it's open for debate. People can suggest alterations or improvements, but to suggest that we remove things based on superficial or immutable characteristics and replacing them on the same characteristics, to me, is patronizing. That is not what teaching kids is about, and it's actually quite discriminatory and or racist to do that. Likewise, the whole argument around, we had Black History Month in October, and that obviously came on the back of we've had the whole Black Lives Matter thing for the whole of last year, pretty much. And all of these movements are suggesting that one particular demographic needs more representation. What about all the other demographics? What about Asians? What about Jewish people? What about, it doesn't really matter. But once we start focusing on one particular immutable characteristic, we have to look at them all. It's easier to just not do that. It's better to not do that and not break people up and not divide people in our society based on the way they look. There was an argument around music replacing Mozart with Stormzy, who is a popular artist of the time. You're clearly familiar with him. He's got a very popular song called Shut Up. It's just, it's incomparable. It doesn't make any sense. It's pure tokenism. On the literary side, we had arguments to replace Rudyard Kipling with Maya Angelou, who Maya Angelou is a respected author. She's quite good. I wouldn't say she's as good as Rudyard Kipling, but that's a subjective matter. But I wouldn't want to remove the Jungle Book just because people think that they want to judge authors of yesterday by today's standards, because it was about his works, not necessarily his personal opinions. And the Jungle Book was one of my favorite books growing up. I think it's the first book I bought for my niece, actually. I love it. But this whole idea of looking at everything through history, through a racial lens or through a very liberal, progressive, contemporary lens that doesn't make any sense. And it's wider than education. It's societal. We've got Sadiq Khan setting up a commission in London to look at which statues and monuments to tear down next, because people might not necessarily be slave owners or have been slave owners in the past, but may have any link to the British Empire at any point and had a role in its administration. It is bonkers, and I don't think normal people want it. I think it is just extremists and activists pushing an agenda, and then we've got the metropolitan liberal elite, which by that I mean people in Westminster, so parliamentarians, mainstream media, all gathered together in this capital, in this bubble, thinking that this is normal because it's the voice they hear the most, because the vocal minority is in their ears at all times. But step outside of Westminster, and people don't care about these issues. It's not that people are anti-woke; it's people don't really give a damn about wokeness outside of Westminster, and that's what we need the metropolitan liberal elites to wake up to. And that again is partly what happened on Thursday. Labour took a knee. The Labour leadership took a knee last year, and people won't forgive them for that.
Well, I think you're 100% right. I mean, north of Watford Gap, when people hear about this decolonisation and then talk about how we should be in some way feel bad about colonial history, most of the people would say, well, hang on a minute.
Mm.
My ancestors weren't doing too well out of this either. We up chimneys and in factories and on fields and peasants. There's a ruling elite of people who were in charge over much of the world then, but they were oppressing people in their own country and elsewhere. It is not about colour per se; it's about class. And we're all being oppressed. We exported our oppression very effectively, but it wasn't us. And I think that's why we get so very annoyed in outside of London about this whole thing, and why the people are looking for something different, because we cannot relate to this projection of guilt, because it simply doesn't apply, and yet somehow history is being rewritten to make us all guilty of slave ownership or whatever it might be. And many of our ancestors actually lived, very similar lives to the people oppressed in other countries.
Yeah, it's Orwellian, isn't it? This neo-Marxist agenda to rewrite history and create a year zero, as Pol Pot suggested. This whole idea that everything from the past is bad, so we're going to start from scratch and we're all better now. But even that doesn't make sense, because within the woke lot, they're always eating themselves. Right now we've got the trans people trying to cancel the feminists who are trying to cancel them, and nothing actually adds up. Because if you are in that circle long enough, you will do or say something that offends someone within that community, and they will come for you. You can never be woke enough.
Yeah, and talking of people being offended and coming for you, you've had some difficulties because of your conservative views, around people from perhaps the BLM movement and things like that. And I won't dignify some of the things that have been said to you by repeating them, but they're pretty atrocious, simply based on your views. And this segmentation of people, this drive to make us all feel differently, and force people, maybe of certain ethnicities or whatever, to all believe they should speak, act, and vote the same way. That's perhaps the most insidious thing that I think we've seen in recent years.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's this, what do you call it, the horseshoe of politics. So the far left is much closer to the far right than the center, and that's evident in what they're talking about. What they're talking about here is white supremacy. What they're saying is, in some way, white people are more supreme to black people. That's what they're saying with what they're doing with their actions, in suggesting, this what we call the soft bigotry of low expectations, suggesting that ethnic minority people can't reach the same goals as white people and need entry requirements at universities lowered, or need special circumstances here and there, positive discrimination, positive action, whatever you want to call it. It's all a nonsense, because what we need to be doing, in my opinion, is raising standards for everyone, raise expectations for everyone, and people will rise to meet them. The moment you start creating a different experience for a different group of people, you are in fact segregating society, and that's what they're doing. They're dividing us up based on our class, based on our race, based on our sexuality, based on our gender, based on whatever they want. And while you're right, there are elements of class issues in this country. That's been one of the most prominent issues, well, forever in this country. But even that is a divisive one, and we need to break away from trying to split people up into these things, and and focus on what makes people individuals, or what brings us together as individuals. Because we are all different, we're all unique, but at the same time, we're all British, and that's what unites us. And again, we should always focus on the things that unite us over the things that separate us, because that's what gives the left power, really. That's what they're after, power over us, to control our vote. It's obviously not working, but they're giving it a good shot.
Absolutely, and I think meritocracy, where you thrive by your own efforts and skills, regardless of where you're from, who you are, etc., is what most on the right, at least, strive for and would love to see. We're into the last few minutes, so I was going to just hit a couple more things, before we finish. The BLM movement. Um, Obviously we all understand, and anyone sane, rational person wants everyone to have an equal opportunity in life, and I think racism per se is rather prehistoric, a mindset of another era, really. But the movement has got great power, and it's, with you said, with the Labour Party taking the knee, the police taking the knee, footballers on our screens regularly taking the knee, Sky Sports, for example, constantly flashing BLM messages everywhere. Is this movement going to continue, do you think, to divide and grow strong, divide us and grow stronger? Or do you think it's going to run out of puff?
I hope it's going to run out of puff because, like you say, we believe in this country in meritocracy and equal opportunities, that everyone should have an equal chance of success. But what the hard left are really pushing is equal outcomes, that everyone has the same end point. And that the only way to get that is communism. And we know that communism doesn't work. It's the greatest killer of people around the world. And it's something we should never aim at. But they have this utopian idea that they think they can create a better society, regardless of the facts of history, that it's never worked. So we need to absolutely make sure that Black Lives Matter, as a political movement, dies a very rapid death. It's already reaching the point in this country that most people have kind of realized that it's toxic and divisive and moved on, even though people joined essentially through misguided, nobody wants to be racist. This is a very anti-racist, to take the term, country, but people joined the movement because they thought, well, that makes sense. But of course, Black Lives Matter. But then they quickly clocked on, or eventually clocked on, to realizing that it's a political movement with a neo-Marxist agenda, and have kind of abandoned it. And most of the celebrities have now, most of the high-profile companies that jumped on the bandwagon have now moved away from it. There are still some that are lagging behind, but I think they will wake up eventually, and this will all filter down. But the problem is, it's still a big deal in America. And whenever America has a societal issue, we are not very far behind. So we need to hope that they wake up to it too.
Amen. So, final word. We've discussed the state of politics. We've discussed the fact that the Labour Party are not effectively going to challenge for government some time to come. So we've got a Conservative government for a while to come, yes. But we've also discussed many of the things in this country that aren't conservative, aren't liberal-minded, aren't libertarian. What should people watching programs like this, people who feel disenfranchised because there really isn't a party for them to vote for, people who are struggling because they have conservative values, what should they do? Should they just knuckle down and hope the Tories pull it round, or should they join a party? Should they do a YouTube channel? What do you think? How can we fight back?
That's a good question. I think look into Reform and Reclaim, also look into the Conservatives, maybe join all three, and help pull them to the right. That's what I would suggest, because obviously the Labour Party have hundreds of thousands of members, the Conservatives have very, very few. And I think if there were more people that were members of the Conservative Party with conservative views and made those views known to the party, then they would have to be responsible to their members. So yes, work with these outlier parties to put pressure on the Conservatives, but also maybe try and work with the Conservatives to keep them honest and make sure they don't drift further to the left.
Sounds good advice. Well, on that note, I just want to thank you. I think it's been a really, really interesting chat. I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting you. It's been a fun conversation. I've enjoyed listening to what you've got to say. So thank you for joining us today.
Bill, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And to everyone out there who's watched this, same routine. If you like it, share it. If you really like it, click on the follow, subscribe to the YouTube channel, help us to get this message out. More people who listen to it, more people we can get thinking and talking, the better it is for our society and our democracy. So let's get sharing, folks. But for now, it's good night and goodbye from us.